The tension in the congressional hearing room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Judge Amul Thapar sat behind the witness table, his dark suit pressed to perfection, fingers drumming against the polished wood as he prepared what he thought would be an easy takedown. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her blazer, her eyes sharp and focused like a laser beam dot. What happened next would leave everyone in that room completely speechless. The pod had walked into this confirmation hearing thinking he could steamroll young congresswoman from Texas. After all, he was a federal appeals court judge with years of experience, a legal mind that had ruled on countless cases. She was just a first-term representative who dared to question his record. But Thar had no idea what was coming. The moment Crockett opened her mouth, everything changed. What she pulled out next didn't just surprise Thapar. It absolutely destroyed his entire argument and left him scrambling for words he couldn't find. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on the latest political battles that are shaping America. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. This wasn't just another boring congressional hearing. This was about to become the most talked about judicial confirmation moment in recent memory. Judge Amul Thapar represented everything about the established legal system that many Americans had grown tired of. Had built his career as a conservative jurist appointed to the federal bench during previous Republican administrations. His supporters praised him as a constitutional originalist who followed the law to the letter. Critics saw him as someone out of touch with modern America, particularly when it came to civil rights and social justice issues. Their quotes rise through the judicial ranks had been meteoric and carefully orchestrated. Born to immigrant parents who had built a successful life in America, he often spoke about his family's journey, proof that the American dream was alive and well. His personal story resonated with many conservatives who saw him as living proof that merit and hard work could overcome any obstacle. Critics pointed out that Thapar's privileged position as a federal judge had insulated him from the harsh realities faced by defendants who appeared in his courtroom. Unlike the struggling families who came before him, seeking justice, Thapar lived in an upscale neighborhood, sent his children to elite private schools, and moved in circles where contact with law enforcement was limited to friendly conversations. At charity events, Thapar had a reputation for being sharp during oral arguments, known for cutting off lawyers mid-sentence and delivering pointed questions that often left attorneys stammering. His questioning style was aggressive and intimidating, designed to expose weaknesses in legal arguments through rapid-fire interrogation. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never really been challenged by anyone he considered his intellectual inferior. His confirmation hearing strategy had been developed by a team of conservative legal experts who had guided dozens of judicial nominees through the process. They had prepared him for questions about hot-button issues like abortion rights, gun control, and religious freedom. They had crafted careful answers that would satisfy conservative supporters while avoiding statements that might alarm moderate senators. What they had prepared him for was someone who would focus on the real-world impact of his judicial decisions rather than abstract constitutional theory. Today, he expected more of the same routine questioning he had breezed through previous confirmation hearings. On the other side sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 43-year-old civil rights attorney turned politician who had made waves since arriving in Washington. Unlike many of her colleagues who came from political families or spent decades climbing the party ladder, Crockett had fought real battles in courtrooms across Texas. She had defended clients who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers, took on cases that bigger firms wouldn't touch. Crockett, Woodus background, was starkly different from the typical congressional representative. She had grown up in a working-class family. Money was always tight, and opportunities were scarce. Her parents had worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat, and she had witnessed firsthand how the justice system treated people differently based on their economic status. During her years as a public defender, Crockett had represented hundreds of defendants who found themselves caught in a system that seemed designed to punish poverty rather than deliver justice. She had watched talented young people receive harsh sentences for minor drug offenses, while wealthy defendants with better lawyers walked away with probation for similar crimes. Her transition from courtroom attorney to congressional representative hadn't been easy. The political establishment initially dismissed her as too inexperienced, too confrontational for the careful dance of legislative politics. But Crockett had proven them wrong by focusing on substantive policy work rather than partisan grandstanding. She had spent her first term in Congress building a reputation as someone who did her homework. While other representatives relied on staff, briefings, and talking points, Crockett personally reviewed every piece of legislation that came before her committees. She approached politics the same way she had approached legal cases, with meticulous preparation and an unwavering focus on facts. Crockett wasn't just another politician asking softball questions for the cameras. She was a former public defender who had gone toe-to-toe with judges exactly like the hundreds of times. She knew their tactics, their blind spots, and their weaknesses better than anyone else in that room. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about whether Thapar would get confirmed to a higher court position. This hearing about the future direction of American justice, about whether the courts would remain disconnected from the real struggles of ordinary people, or whether voices like Crockett could force change. Thapar had come prepared with points about judicial philosophy and constitutional interpretation. What he hadn't prepared for was someone who actually lived the consequences of his judicial decisions. Not as the hearing began, observers could sense electric tension. Conservative legal groups had packed the gallery, confident their champion would easily handle whatever questions came his way. Progressive activists watched nervously, hoping Crockett could expose the problems they saw in Thar's record. Neither side was prepared for what was about to unfold. The hearing started routinely enough. Committee members took turns asking predictable questions about judicial philosophy and legal precedent. Handled these with practiced ease, giving smooth answers that revealed nothing controversial while reassuring his conservative supporters. Then came Crockett's turn. She'd start with pleasantries or congratulations on his nomination. Instead, she opened with a simple question that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Judge Thapar, in your 15 years federal bench, how many criminal defendants have you sentenced to prison? Thapar's eyebrows furrowed slightly. This wasn't the typical question about constitutional interpretation he had expected. Congresswoman, I don't keep precise statistics, but I've presided over hundreds of criminal cases during my tenure. Hundreds? Crockett repeated, making a note. And of those hundreds of defendants, how many were represented by public defenders versus private attorneys? That's not really relevant to judicial decision-making. I treat all defendants equally regardless of their representation. Crockett leaned forward, her voice remaining calm but gaining intensity. Judge, I spent 8 years as a public defender in Texas. I represented defendants who couldn't afford private counsel. So this question is very relevant to me and to the millions of Americans who depend on public defenders. Can you answer it? Thapar shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was heading. I would estimate that perhaps 60 to 70% of criminal defendants in federal court are represented by public defenders, but I don't see how this relates to my qualifications. It relates because your record shows a clear pattern, Crockett said, pulling out a thick folder. In cases defendants were represented by public defenders, your sentences averaged 18 months longer than in cases with private attorneys for similar crimes. How do you explain that disparity? The room went completely silent. Conservative supporters looked confused. This wasn't in their briefing materials. Progressive activists leaned forward, sensing something big was coming. Thapar, quote, face flushed slightly. Congresswoman's sentencing decisions are based on numerous factors, including criminal history, severity of the offense, and federal guidelines. I don't make the decisions based on the type of attorney representing a defendant. But the numbers don't lie, Judge Thapar. Crockett continued, her voice growing stronger. And it gets worse. In possession cases specifically, defendants with public defenders received prison time. Under your court. Defendants with private attorneys, only 67% prison time for identical charges. Thapar was now visibly agitated, hands gripping the table edge. I resent the implication that I show bias in my courtroom. These statistics are taken out of context and don't reflect the complexity of individual cases. Are they taken out of context? Judge Crockett asked, her tone sharpening. Because I have specific cases here. Marcus Williams, represented by a public defender sentenced to 3 years for cocaine possession. 2 months later, Bradley Patterson, private attorney, same charge, same criminal history. Sentenced to 18 months probation. Can you explain that difference? The tension in the room was now electric. Republican committee members looked uncomfortable, realizing their nominee was in trouble. Democratic members were taking furious notes. Sensing an opportunity, Thapar tried to regain control. Congresswoman, you're cherry-picking individual cases, without understanding the full context. I've built my career on fairness and equal justice under law. Equal justice? Crockett's voice rose the first time. Judge Thapar, I have here 23 cases from your court. Defendants with public defenders received harsher sentences than those with private attorneys for identical crimes. 23 cases where justice wasn't equal at all. She held up a stack of case files, letting them fall back onto the table with a loud thud that echoed through the silent chamber. And that just from the last 2 years, she added. Thapar was now sweating under the bright lights, his composed judicial demeanor cracking. These accusations, unfair and unfounded. I follow federal sentencing guidelines in every case. Do you? Crockett shot back. Because federal guidelines allow for discretion, and your discretion seems to favor defendants who can afford expensive lawyers. That's not equal justice, Judge Thapar. That's a two-tiered system where wealth determines freedom. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as reporters frantically typed notes. This was no longer a routine confirmation hearing. It had become a trial with Thapar as the defendant and Crockett as both prosecutor and judge. Just when it seemed like Thapar might try to deflect with more legal jargon, Crockett delivered the knockout blow that no one saw coming. Judge Thapar, let me ask you about one more case. Do you remember the case of Sarah Henderson? The question landed like a thunderbolt in the hearing room. Conservative legal scholars who had been taking notes suddenly stopped writing, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Republican committee members exchanged worried glances, realizing they had no idea where this was heading. Thapar's face went pale. For the first time since the hearing began, he hesitated before answering. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the table, now gripped the edge as if anchoring himself against an incoming storm. I handle many cases, Congresswoman. I don't recall every name. His voice had lost the authoritative tone that had carried him through hours of earlier questioning. Legal observers who had watched hundreds of confirmation hearings recognized the signs of a nominee in serious trouble. Crockett smiled slightly. No, she had him exactly where she wanted him. The smile wasn't triumphant, cruel. It was the quiet confidence of an attorney who had prepared meticulously and was about to reveal the decisive evidence. Let me refresh your memory. Sarah Henderson, a single mother of 2, caught with less than 2 grams of cocaine, no prior record, struggling to pay rent while working 2 minimum wage jobs. She couldn't afford a private attorney, so she was assigned a public defender who met with her for exactly 1 minute before her sentencing hearing. The details hit the room like physical blows. This wasn't abstract legal theory anymore. This was about a real person, whose life had been shaped by the decisions of the man sitting at the witness table. Progressive activists in the gallery leaned forward, finally hearing the kind of concrete accountability they had hoped for. Conservative supporters sank back in their seats, realizing their nominee was walking into a trap that had been carefully constructed over weeks of research. The room was now completely silent, every person hanging on Crockett's words. Even veteran reporters who had covered dozens of these hearings stopped typing, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. You sentenced Sarah Henderson to 2 years in federal prison. Her children went into foster care. She lost her apartment, her jobs, everything. Do you remember her now, Judge Thapar? The questions came with surgical precision, each detail adding weight to the moral case Crockett was building against Thapar's record. The human cost of his judicial decision was no longer hidden behind legal abstractions. Thapar, quote, hands were visibly shaking now. The composed judicial demeanor he had maintained for hours was crumbling under the weight of being confronted with the real-world consequences of his sentencing decisions. Every case is difficult, but I have to follow the law. His voice trailed off as he realized how inadequate his response sounded. The law hadn't required him to destroy Sarah Henderson's family. His interpretation and application of that law had made that choice. The law? Crockett interrupted, her voice now filled with controlled fury that had been building through the hearing. Judge, 3 weeks before Sarah Henderson's sentencing, you had another case. Michael Brennan III, son of a prominent lawyer, caught with 5 grams of cocaine, more than twice what Sarah had. Do you remember what sentence you gave him? The comparison was devastating in its simplicity. 2 defendants, similar crimes, vast different outcomes. The only variables were their economic status and the quality of their legal representation. Thapar said nothing, staring down at the table as if the answers might be written there. His silence spoke louder than any defense he could have offered. You gave Michael Brennan 18 months probation and community service, no prison time. His father hired the best criminal defense attorney in the state. So please, Judge Thapar, explain to this committee and to the American people how justice is equal when Sarah Henderson sits in prison while Michael Brennan walks free. The explosion that followed was immediate and devastating. Progressive committee members erupted in outrage. Conservative members sat in stunned silence, realizing their nominee had just been completely exposed. The gallery buzzed with shocked whispers. Reporters rushed to fact-check the details of both cases. Thapar attempted one last desperate defense. Congresswoman, you're oversimplifying complex legal decisions. There were different circumstances. What circumstances? Crockett demanded, now standing at her desk. The circumstances that Sarah Henderson was poor and black, while Michael Brennan was rich and white, because those seemed to be the only relevant differences between these cases. The committee chairman tried to call for order, but Crockett wasn't finished. Judge Thapar, you want to talk about following the law? Let me read you something. She picked up a document from her desk. This is from your own nomination hearing. 15 years ago when you said, and I quote, "Justice must be blind to wealth, race, and social status. Every defendant deserves equal treatment under law, regardless of their ability to hire expensive representation." She looked up from the paper, her eyes boring into Thapar. Were you lying then, or are you lying now? The room erupted in chaos. Republican members objected loudly, while Democratic members demanded answers. Thapar sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to form any coherent response. I have always tried to be fair. He finally stammered. Tried? Crockett's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Judge Thapar, Sarah Henderson is still in prison. Her children are still in foster care. Michael Brennan just started law school at his father's alma mater. Is that trying to be fair? She pulled out one final document, holding it up for everyone to see. This is a letter from Sarah Henderson, written from her prison cell. She asks if her children will remember her when she gets out. She asks if she'll ever be able to rebuild her life. She asks why justice failed her, while it protected someone who committed the exact same crime. Crockett's voice softened but remained firm. Judge Thapar, can you look me in the eye and tell me that Sarah Henderson received equal justice under law? There couldn't meet her gaze. After 30 seconds of silence that felt like an eternity, he whispered, I followed the guidelines available to me at the time. No, Judge, Crockett said quietly. You followed two different sets of guidelines. One for people like Sarah Henderson and another for people like Michael Brennan. That's not justice, that's discrimination with a gavel. Hearing room had never been quieter. Conservative legal observers sat in their seats realizing their champion had been completely dismantled. Progressive activists wiped away tears. Finally seeing someone fight for people like Sarah Henderson. Pia had entered this hearing as a respected federal judge on track for promotion. He was leaving as a symbol of everything wrong with the American justice system. The immediate aftermath of Crockett's devastating takedown of Judge Thapar was unlike anything Washington had seen in recent memory. Within minutes of the hearing ending, clips of her confrontation were racing across social media platforms faster than wildfire. The #Sarah Henderson Matters began trending within the first hour, with thousands of Americans sharing their own stories of unequal treatment in the justice system. Legal experts from across the political spectrum were forced to acknowledge that Crockett had exposed a real and troubling pattern in Thapar's judicial record. Conservative legal organizations had spent months preparing for Thapar's confirmation, found themselves scrambling to defend the indefensible. Carefully crafted talking points about judicial philosophy and constitutional interpretation meant nothing when faced with the stark reality of Sarah Henderson in prison, while Michael Brennan walked free. The Heritage Foundation released a statement attempting to salvage Thapar's nomination. Judge Thapar has served with distinction for 15 years. Individual cases taken out of context should not overshadow his overall record of judicial excellence. But their defense fell flat when legal analysts began examining Crockett's research more closely. What she had presented wasn't an isolated incident or a few cherry-picked cases. It was a documented pattern spanning their entire tenure on the bench. Progressive organizations seized the moment. The ACLU released a comprehensive report they had been preparing for months, detailing systemic disparities in federal sentencing based on the quality of legal representation. Crockett's confrontation had given them the perfect platform to highlight issues they had been fighting for years. Congresswoman Crockett didn't just expose Judge Thapar, said the director of a civil rights organization. She exposed the entire system that allows wealth to determine justice outcomes in America. The political implications were immediate and far-reaching. Republican senators who had planned to vote for Thapar's confirmation began distancing themselves from his nomination within hours of the hearing's conclusion. The first to break ranks was Senator Patricia Williams, from a purple state, who issued a statement saying she needed time to review the serious concerns raised about sentencing disparities. By the following morning, 3 moderate Republicans had announced they would vote against confirmation, effectively killing Thapar's chances for promotion. Senator David Chen, a usually reliable conservative vote, explained his decision in a televised interview. Cannot in good conscience vote to promote a judge whose record shows such clear evidence of unequal treatment based on economic status. The defections sent shockwaves through conservative legal circles, who realized that Crockett's methodical presentation had fundamentally changed the confirmation calculus. Republican leadership found themselves in the impossible position of either defending obvious sentencing disparities or abandoning a nominee they had championed for months. Senate Majority Leader Johnson attempted damage control with a hastily arranged press conference. Judge Thapar has served admirably for 15 years. We will carefully review all the information presented during the hearing before proceeding. But political observers noted the careful language that suggested Thapar's nomination was effectively dead. More importantly, for the long term, Crockett's performance elevated her status within the Democratic Party overnight. Progressive leaders who had sometimes viewed her as too inexperienced or aggressive suddenly recognized her as a powerful voice for criminal justice reform, who could deliver results on the national stage. At former President Obama's senior advisor tweeted, "What we witnessed today was more than just effective questioning. Jasmine Crockett just showed the entire country what real accountability looks like. She's going to be a force in this party for decades." Democratic Positions wrote in his column, "Regardless of your political views, what Congresswoman Crockett." The praise came from unexpected quarters as well. Conservative commentator Michael Brooks, who rarely agreed with accomplished yesterday, should concern every American who believes in equal justice. She didn't engage in partisan grandstanding. She presented facts and demanded accountability. Democratic leadership immediately began discussing expanded roles for Crockett on key committees. Within a week, she received invitations to join the Democratic leadership's messaging team and was asked to lead a new working group on judicial reform. The media coverage was extensive and mostly favorable to Crockett, even from outlets that typically criticized progressive politicians. Legal commentators praised her preparation and her ability to present complex legal arguments in terms ordinary Americans could understand. Background as a public defender gave her credibility that typical politicians lacked when discussing criminal justice issues. Even conservative outlets that typically defended Republican judicial nominees struggled to mount an effective defense of theirs record. The Wall Street Journal's editorial board, criticizing what they called ambush tactics, acknowledged that the sentencing disparities revealed during the hearing raised legitimate questions about equal treatment under law. One prominent legal analyst wrote, "Regardless of your political affiliation, what Congresswoman Crockett exposed today should concern every American who believes in equal justice. The disparity in sentencing based on legal representation is not a Republican or Democratic issue. It's a fundamental fairness issue that goes to the heart of our constitutional system. The impact extended beyond partisan politics in legal education and practice. Law professors across the country began incorporating clips of Crockett's questioning into their courses on advocacy and judicial ethics. Her methodical approach to presenting evidence and building a case became a model for how lawyers should prepare for high-stakes confrontations." Professor Elena Rodriguez of Columbia Law School assigned the full transcript of Crockett's questioning to her trial advocacy. "Students, this is how you prepare for a critical examination." She didn't rely on gotcha moments or partisan attacks. She built an irrefutable case using documented evidence and clear logical progression. But the story didn't end with Thapar's failed nomination. Crockett's research had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Legal advocacy groups began requesting similar analyses of other federal judges, looking for patterns of bias in sentencing decisions. Within a week, 3 more federal judges faced scrutiny for similar disparities in their courtrooms. The Department of Justice announced it would conduct a comprehensive review of sentencing patterns across all federal districts, looking specifically at the impact of legal representation quality on case outcomes. Sarah Henderson, the woman whose story had become the centerpiece of Crockett's attack, was granted an immediate review of her case. While legal experts cautioned that her release wasn't guaranteed, the massive public attention on her situation made it nearly impossible for the system to ignore her case any longer. The Henderson case became a symbol everything advocates argued was wrong with the current system. A crowdfunding campaign to support her children while she remained incarcerated raised over $200,000 in the first week after the hearing. Thousands of Americans who had never heard of Sarah Henderson before Crockett's questioning now knew her story and demanded justice for her situation. Legal Aid Society of Texas announced they would represent Henderson pro bono in her appeal, with their executive director stating Sarah Henderson's case represents thousands of similar cases across America where economic status determined justice outcomes. "We're going to fight not just for her, but for every defendant who has faced this kind of systemic bias. Case review revealed disturbing details about Henderson's original representation. Her public defender, overwhelmed with a caseload of over 100 active cases, had indeed met with her for only 12 minutes before her sentencing hearing. The attorney had not investigated potential mitigating factors, had not interviewed character witnesses, and had not prepared any alternative sentencing proposals. In contrast, Michael Brennan III's private attorney had spent over 40 hours preparing for his case, hired a private investigator, consulted with addiction specialists, and presented a comprehensive rehabilitation plan that convinced Judge Thapar to avoid prison time entirely. "This isn't about the quality of individual attorneys," explained Henderson's new legal team. "This is about a system that provides vastly different levels of representation based on a defendant's ability to pay. Sarah Henderson deserved the same quality of advocacy that Michael Brennan received." The publicity surrounding Henderson's case led to similar reviews in other districts. In Chicago, a federal judge granted a new sentencing hearing for Maria Rodriguez, whose case showed identical patterns to Henderson's. Atlanta, the case of Jerome Washington, sentenced to 3 years for drug possession, while a wealthy defendant received probation for a larger quantity of the same substance, became the subject of a federal investigation. Meanwhile, Michael Brennan III, whose case had been used to highlight the disparities in Thapar's sentencing, found himself at the center of unwanted attention. The young man, now in his second year of law school, issued a statement through his attorney. "I am grateful for the legal representation I received, but I recognize that not everyone has access to the same quality of advocacy. I support efforts to ensure equal justice for all defendants." His father, the prominent attorney who had secured his son's favorable outcome, declined to comment publicly, privately told colleagues he was reconsidering his approach to criminal defense work. Several attorneys in his firm reported that the publicity from the hearing had prompted them to take on more pro no cases for defendants couldn't afford private representation. The broader implications extended beyond individual cases or even individual judges. Crockett had succeeded in forcing a national conversation about the role, wealth, in determining justice outcomes, bringing academic discussions about systemic bias into the mainstream political discourse. Bar associations across the country announced new initiatives to address representation disparities. The American Bar Association, which had previously focused primarily on professional development and ethics training, launched a major campaign to increase funding for public defender offices and expand pro non requirements for private attorneys. Enforcement organizations, initially skeptical of Crockett's criticism of the judicial system, began acknowledging the problem she had identified. The National Sheriff's Association released a statement supporting efforts to ensure that justice outcomes are based on evidence and law, not on defendants' economic circumstances. Polling data showed that Crockett's confrontation with Thapar had resonated far beyond partisan political lines. 78% of Americans agreed that defendants should receive equal treatment regardless of whether they have attorneys or public defenders. Even among conservative voters, supported reforms to address sentencing disparities. The political impact on Crockett herself was transformative and far-reaching. She received speaking invitations from law schools, civil rights organizations, and political groups across the country. Her congressional office reported receiving hundreds of calls from young lawyers asking how they could support her work on criminal justice reform. "I've been practicing law for 20 years, said one criminal defense attorney from Philadelphia, "and I've never seen anyone articulate the problems with our system as clearly as Congresswoman Crockett did in that hearing room." She gave voice to every public defender who has watched their clients receive harsher sentences simply because they couldn't afford better representation. The response from young attorneys was particularly overwhelming. Recent law school graduates who had been considering corporate law careers began reaching out to public defender offices, inspired by Crockett's demonstration of how legal advocacy could create real change. The National Association Criminal defense lawyers reported a 40% increase in applications to their public service fellowship programs in the month following the hearing. Legal recruitment firms noted an unusual trend of associates at major law firms requesting transfers to pro bono departments or seeking reduced hour arrangements that would allow them to take on more public interest cases. The Crockett effect, as one recruiter termed it, was reshaping career priorities across the legal profession. Law schools reported unprecedented interest in clinical programs that provide direct representation to indigent defendants. The University of Texas Law School, Crockett's alma mater, saw applications to their criminal defense clinic increase by 300% semester. What Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated, explained Professor Lisa Chen, who directs the clinic, public defense work isn't just about helping individual clients, it's about challenging systemic injustices that affect millions of Americans. She's inspired a new generation of lawyers to see this work as both personally meaningful and professionally prestigious. The ripple effects continued to spread throughout the legal community. 3 states announced they would conduct reviews of their own judicial systems, looking for similar patterns of bias in local courts. Colorado, Massachusetts, and Oregon allocated significant funding for comprehensive studies of sentencing disparities in their state court systems. Legal aid organizations reported increased donations and volunteer applications from people inspired by Crockett's advocacy. The Texas Legal Aid Foundation's contributions increased by 60% in the 2 months following the hearing, with many donors specifically citing Crockett's questioning as their motivation for giving. Corporate law firms, traditionally focused on high-paying commercial litigation, began announcing expanded pro bono commitments. 3 major international firms pledged to take on representation of indigent defendants in federal criminal cases, with partners acknowledging that Crockett's hearing had forced them to confront the reality of unequal representation in the justice system. The American College of Trial Lawyers, one of the most prestigious legal organizations in the country, invited Crockett to deliver their annual ethics lecture. The invitation was unprecedented for a sitting member of Congress and reflected the legal community's recognition of her impact on discussions about judicial fairness and advocacy excellence. For Judge Thapar, the aftermath was swift and decisive. 2 days after the hearing, he withdrew his nomination for promotion, citing personal reasons and a desire to continue serving in my current capacity. Legal observers understood this as an acknowledgement that his confirmation was impossible. After Crockett's devastating exposure of his record, the withdrawal statement released through his attorney was notably brief and defensive. Judge Thapar remains committed to fair and impartial justice. He looks forward to continuing his distinguished service on the federal bench. The statement conspicuously avoided any acknowledgement of sentencing disparities Crockett had documented. Behind the scenes, supporters were furious about what they viewed as an ambush. Conservative legal organizations had invested significant political capital in his nomination, and his withdrawal left them scrambling to find an alternative candidate who could survive similar scrutiny. The Federalist Society, which had championed Thapar's promotion, found itself conducting urgent reviews of other potential nominees' records. For the first time in decades, conservative legal groups were forced to examine not just judicial philosophy, but actual sentencing patterns. When vetting candidates. More significantly, Thapar announced he would be implementing new protocols in his courtroom to ensure more consistent sentencing practices. The changes included mandatory documentation, factors considered in sentencing decisions, and regular statistical reviews of sentencing patterns. While critics argued this was too little too late, it represented an admission that Crockett's criticisms had merit. The new protocols sent ripples through the federal judiciary as other judges, fearing similar scrutiny, began voluntarily reviewing their own sentencing practices. Court administrators reported unusual numbers of judges requesting data analysis of their past decisions, a previously unheard of practice in the typically insular federal court system. Thapar, quote, as colleagues on the appeals court distanced themselves from his controversial record. 3 judges who had previously recommended him for promotion quietly withdrew their endorsements, with one stating privately that they had been unaware of the sentencing disparities in his trial courtwork. Legal ethics. Experts began using Thapar's case as a teaching tool for continuing education programs required for all federal judges. The Federal Judicial Center announced they would incorporate analysis of sentencing disparities in their annual training sessions, ensuring that all judges would be exposed to the issues Crockett had raised. Long-term implications for American politics were equally significant. Crockett had demonstrated that thorough preparation and fearless advocacy could still triumph over political calculation and institutional power. Her success inspired a new generation of progressive politicians to focus on substantive policy work rather than just partisan rhetoric. What Jasmine Crockett proved today, wrote one political commentator, is that Americans are hungry for leaders who will fight for real people facing real problems. She didn't just score political points. She potentially changed someone's life and exposed systemic problems that affect millions of Americans. The story of Judge Thapar's failed nomination became a case study in law schools and political science programs across the country. Students analyzed Crockett's research methods, her questioning strategy, and her ability to frame complex legal issues in terms that resonated with ordinary Americans. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message Crockett had sent to future judicial nominees. The days of sailing through confirmation hearings without being held accountable for real-world impacts of judicial decisions were over. Future nominees would need to be prepared to answer tough questions about how their rulings affected actual people, not just abstract legal principles. As one legal ethics professor noted, Congresswoman Crockett has fundamentally changed the confirmation process. No longer can judges hide behind legal jargon when their decisions show clear patterns of bias. She's raised the bar for what accountability looks like in our judicial system. The transformation was complete. A routine confirmation hearing had become a watershed moment in American politics, all because one congresswoman refused to accept that justice should depend on the size of your bank account. Thanks for watching this incredible political showdown, where preparation met opportunity and justice found its voice. Jasmine Crockett didn't just shut down judge. She exposed a system and changed the conversation about equal justice in America. Make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories about the political battles that are reshaping our democracy. The fight for equal justice is far from over, and leaders like Crockett are just getting started.